Hi everyone, this is a recording for the equity policy for UADC 2020. It's going to outline the expected behavior and all the code of conduct that you requested to follow throughout this tournament. It's going to extend throughout the scope of this tournament, and we will cover everything that you need to know within this. The document's also going to be attached with this link. You can move on, Sanya. Hi, so the equity team consists of myself. Hi, I'm Namita. Along with me are Sania, Shudipto, Rifat, and Bobby. You can message us at any point of time. Our contact details will be given towards the end of this presentation, and we will put up a separate message regarding the same as well. So, just in general, why do we think the equity policy or equity in general is something that's really important? Is obviously one is because we think that equity within the scope of debating or debating as an activity in general is something that requires you to be diplomatic, it's something that requires you to mm, consistently maintain the dignity of others. We think it's about the respectful exchange of ideas amongst people. We think that therefore equity is something that balances one's behavior towards other individuals. We need to absolutely make sure that everyone feels inclusive and everyone feels welcome within this activity. We do not mean to include any behavior or any sort of actions that discriminate people or make them feel bad about joining this tournament or joining this activity in general. Um, so the scope of this tournament is all individuals participating in UADC 2020 in any capacity. This includes debaters, adjudicators, co-adjudicators, member of the organizing committee, the TAP team as well, observers, any coaches or guides that you might have, as well as us, the members of the equity team. And just to give you a brief guideline on what we think discriminatory conduct is, we think that discriminatory conduct is any sort of behavior that excludes people on particular grounds. This can include bullying/ragging. It includes direct and indirect discrimination, all forms of harassment, including repeatedly interrupting people during their speeches, but it also extends to sexual harassment in terms of consent, which is going to be covered on a bit more later on, victimization, and any form of vilification. Just as a side note, this recording that is there is not the fullest extent of what equity has. We require you to go through the equity document as well, which discusses things in much more detail. And you're required to know all of the information that's present within this document. Some of the protected attributes against which you're not allowed to discriminate are age group, debating ability, disability, language status, gender or intersex status, infectious diseases, institutional affiliations, marital or relationship status, sexual practices or experiences, political affiliations, pregnancy and personal experiences of abortion if there are any, race, color, descent, national or ethnic origin, any sort of ethno-religious background, any religious affiliation, beliefs, views, and practices, sex and sexual orientation, and socioeconomic status and background. Of course, this list is not fully exhaustive. If there are other elements, we do think that those are also included under protected attributes. Please keep your mind open for the same. The next thing that we'd want to talk about that's extremely important within the scope of this debate is how you're going to go about sexual interactions with respect to positive consent. Even though this is an online platform, we think that positive consent is required at all steps, even when you want to approach someone on a particular platform to text them, no matter what sort of messages you want to tell them. Um, Always seek positive consent while engaging in anything sexual or anything that might lead towards something sexual. Unwanted advances are always an equity violation. There are no excuses for the same. Positive consent is obtained only when the person explicitly says yes, which is to say, a maybe, or if someone is hesitating to say yes, does not constitute as positive consent. It is up to you to make sure that you get an enthusiastic yes, wherein you know that the person is 100% comfortable with the same. If the other person says yes under some form of coercion, if they say so reluctantly after you pressurize them, or if they say so under some sort of stress, such as peer pressure, or using your social leverage or power dynamics to make them say yes, that yes is not counted as positive consent, and it will be criticized and it will come under a violation of the same. And if you misconstrued someone's interactions with you as them coming onto you or them flirting with you when they've explicitly told you later on that that's not the case. Please apologize and move on. There is absolutely no need to take this matter further than it already is. And now I hand it on to Bobby to continue the rest of the presentation.
All right, thank you, Namita. So in terms of general code of conduct that you expect from all participants, the first and foremost is please respect the rules of the competition. The adjudication core during their debate briefing has already talked about the norms of the norms and etiquette of being in an online competition. Make sure that you follow all of those rules and guidelines to ensure that everyone has an enjoyable experience at this competition. Please refrain from distracting or disrupting other debaters and adjudicators. It is very easy for people to then, interrupt others through unmuting their mics, through POIs, or messaging in the chat box. These things have been explicitly discouraged by the adjudication core, and so please make sure that you take that into account. For the debaters, a couple of general code of conduct that are expected to have is firstly to accept the decision of the adjudicators. And if in the instance that you disagree with the oral adjudication provided by the judges, any sort of concerns that you might have regarding their quality of adjudication, they should be relayed through the official channels that exist. So either you get in touch with the adjudication core or you submit a complaint through the feedback system on TabbyCat. um, we feel that it's not definitely not okay for you to trash talk people using memes, you on shit posting that directly targets these individuals. These are the kinds of conduct that we hope do not manifest by the debaters. However, if you feel that an adjudicator's decision arises from direct or indirect discrimination, if you feel they were being biased or bigoted in some way, that their decision might be influenced by certain factors such as sexism or racism, etc., or that they have engaged in behaviors that violated protected attributes that Namita mentioned earlier, please make sure that you report it to the equity team. Later, Sania is going to explain about the complaints procedures on how that you can do that through our official channels as well. For the judges, please make sure that you refrain from insulting or providing non-constructive commentary on speeches or speakers. There would be instances where you would hear arguments that probably sound funny or that probably sound silly. Please be mindful that tournaments, despite it being a competitive environment, is also a learning tool and platform for many debaters. There are people who are probably debating for their first time, and therefore it should be a priority for judges to be as encouraging and as constructive as possible, because the silly speech or oral adjudication that you might have heard at that point in time doesn't necessarily reflect the best of that person. They can improve, and so therefore please be mindful of these kinds of attitudes that you give towards the debaters themselves. If you feel that a team has become hostile during or after your oral adjudication, or you feel that they've engaged in an equity violation, please do report it to the equity team so that we can take the necessary measures. Now, here are a couple of don't do's for everyone. Firstly, do not make generalizations on the basis of protected attributes. It's very easy for debaters or judges to slip into prejudice and stereotypes when commenting on certain things. Please make sure that you avoid that at all cost. Second, please do not use unnecessary graphic language to illustrate impacts. This oftentimes can become triggering for a lot of people that might have personal experiences with the kind of language that you're trying to use. Thirdly, do not make personal attacks, given that this is a sport that focuses on testing out the quality of your arguments and your responses. Ad hominem attacks simply are just a big no-no in debating tournaments. Fourthly, do not use reclaimed language unless you belong to a group that was historically oppressed by the use of the same. So therefore, be very mindful as well to make sure that you don't use the languages that might oppress other people if you don't belong to that particular identity. And finally, please do not use slurs directed at any individual. What you should do is firstly acknowledge that many conditions are externally imposed as opposed to being intrinsic to any group of people. So instead of saying that poor people can't make good decision, you can say that poverty influences individuals' decisions in such a way that disables them from making particularly more informed choices. So you place the onus on the condition rather than on the people themselves. Second, please apologize if you inevitably end up using graphic language and potentially triggering someone. What you should also do is attack the case and not the person. Be careful when using reclaimed language and make sure that you don't use any discriminatory arguments. Most of the time, the ADCOR are not going to set motions that will require you to condone sexism or classism. These kinds of arguments are also typically unpersuasive, and judges are less likely to believe into those kinds of argumentation. And so, therefore, this is something that you should keep in mind when delivering your speeches. All right, for trigger warnings. So there are going to be sensitive topics that might be involved in discussing a specific motion. For instance, issues about sexual assault, bodily integrity, minority culture, war, etc. When you're talking about these sensitive topics, these are the guidelines that we recommend everyone to follow. Firstly, before starting your speech, provide a general disclaimer that you might potentially be using triggering language within your speech. This provides a heads up for all of the participants in the room, both your opponents and also the judges, so that they can mentally prepare themselves if you are going to use triggering language or characterizations in that debate. Secondly, when you're debating from the perspective of a morally questionable character, also, just give a disclaimer about how possible triggering language and how the views expressed within your speech are not your own, because there are actor debates where you have to talk about someone. For instance, you probably need to talk about you as Donald Trump, and we all don't know how Donald Trump really thinks. And so, therefore, there might be certain things that might be triggering, and make a disclaimer to distance yourself as the person and the debater that you are in that round. Just generally speaking, try as much as possible to avoid overly graphic illustrations when discussing anything sensitive, and you should be good. Next slide, please. In terms of opt-out policy, so what we would like to encourage everyone to do is to have a look at our opt-out policy that is detailed within the equity document, because the procedures are a bit different when it comes to judges and also debaters. And if you're uncertain about the scope of that policy, please make sure that you contact any member of the equity team, and we'll be happy to clarify this opt-out policy. What's important to remember is that in terms of opt-out, I believe that each team is permitted to have 3 times of opting out, meaning that if a person opts out from the debate, then that team has to hire in person, and that this particular opting out can only be done 3 times maximum if a team wants to break into the out rounds. Next slide, please. Gender pronoun policies. So the default that we're having in UADC 2020 is that participants should use gender neutral language as a default. So when in doubt, refer to speakers using their speaking positions. For example, refer to them as the first affirmative speaker, or as the prime minister, or as the previous speaker. Refer to the judging panel simply as panelists or judges. Chairs, please leave the opportunity for speakers to declare their pronouns without explicitly requiring them to do so. If you misgender someone, please apologize and then move on from there. A couple of important notes in terms of online behavior. Firstly, do not misuse your microphone in a way that disrupts other speakers during their speech. So if you are not holding the floor and giving a speech, make sure that you remain muted unless it is your turn, or if your POI was accepted. Secondly, please do not record people without their permission. Thirdly, do not say anything offensive or inappropriate within a chat during the course of the tournament. Refrain from using the chat function, even for private message to other members of your team, using the Zoom chat function, because it might potentially lead to it not being sent privately, and therefore other people looking at private contents of your speech, which is going to be awkward at best, or it can be offensive at worst. So just leave the chat just for timings or raising POIs. Fourth, do not use distracting or disruptive Zoom backgrounds. And fifthly, please use Discord as the default medium for extra feedback. If the judges and the debaters can't agree on any other platforms, that the both parties would be comfortable with. All right, I'm handing it off to Sania to explain about the complaints procedure.
All right. So all complaints that are brought to the equity team are treated as confidential. That means no one but the equity team has access to those complaints unless a complainant allows us to not keep them confidential. In some cases, in order to settle on the fairest course of action, we may ask the complainant to provide additional pieces of evidence. We may want to talk to potential witnesses and the subject of the complaint themselves. But any and all course of action that we take will be with the consent of the complainant. Now, there are two types of complaints that you can file, and I'll talk a bit more about what each of these entail: anonymous and non-anonymous complaint. Now, at any point prior to the resolution of a complainant can withdraw their complaint, and at such a point where a complainant withdraws their complaint, the investigation will automatically stop and the initial complaint will be treated as null and void. Now, the first type of complaint is an anonymous complaint. And we want everyone to feel comfortable in reaching out to us. But we do think it is important to note that if a complaint is anonymous, it does limit our ability to investigate that complaint further, because if we want to request additional pieces of evidence or talk to potential witnesses or the subject of the complaint, these are things that could result in the loss of anonymity. This is why the equity team might be limited in the action that we can take for anonymous complaints. We can do a general announcement so that participants are aware and don't do these incidents again. We can provide a reminder to the subject of the complaint if we deem is needed, but we might be limited in other courses of action that we can take. Another thing that you can do if you wish to remain anonymous is appoint a point of contact. So this point of contact can then be in contact with the equity team. The way to do that is just to fill in the point of contact field in the equity form that I'll be talking about in a bit. And this way, the point of contact can be the person that the equity team goes to consult with regards to the course of action that we can take, and the point of contact will represent the victim's perspective in any fact finding that we do. Another thing that is important to understand is that you should bring forward a complaint even if you don't want us to take any punitive action. We could make a general announcement directed to the public to establish that this kind of behavior shouldn't or should happen in case of positive behavior. But it is incredibly important that you feel comfortable reaching out to us, even if you don't want further action to be taken, even if it is just for the equity team to be aware of something that is happening. And when we take action on a complaint, it can range from issuing a warning to an individual to their removal from the tournament, but it can also be a general announcement to remind everyone not to do a particular thing. But you can read more about this in the resolution mechanism and penalties in our full equity policy, or feel free to reach out to an equity officer and we'd be happy to explain more details of the equity policy. Now, the best way to file a complaint is to fill in our complaint form, tinyurl.com/UADC equity. This is not case sensitive, which means the letters can be capitalized or small. And the important thing to know is that this form does not collect your email addresses, any identifying information, unless you specifically choose to identify yourself so that we can reach out to you for further information. And this form can only be accessed by all members of the equity team. But if there is a reason for you to not register a complaint with the entirety of the equity team, for example, if the complaint is against a member of the equity team themselves, if you think that a member of the equity team could have a conflict with that complaint, or if it is a sensitive complaint and you don't feel comfortable having all members of the equity team read it, then you can reach out to us individually on Discord or WhatsApp. Our WhatsApp numbers are here. They're also on the Clash policy. They're also in our anonymous feedback form. And at the same time, we will be using a Discord channel called Equity Policy to announce anything related to equity that we might want to. So you can also go there and see what the ways to contact us are. And you can also find us on Discord, as we will have equity in brackets written next to our name. And we would like to emphasize that if you bring a request to an individual equity officer, then that will remain confidential. And the equity officer will not divulge that request to other members of the equity team unless the complainant consents to it. We might recommend that someone fill in the anonymous form so that the complaint is on record, but if the complainant does not wish to do so, that action will not be taken and the request will remain confidential to the specific equity officer. And finally, we'd want to remind you that if you have any clashes that you have not already declared, that you do so as soon as possible using the clash form. You can read the details of our clash policy further in terms of confidentiality, who has access to it and who doesn't. And you can also submit clashes as the tournament goes on, but these would be subject to the equity team's assessment. And the rule of thumb to remember is, when in doubt, ask the equity officer. Whether or not you think the concern is large or small, always feel free to reach out to us. If you're not sure if it's an equity concern, still reach out to us and we're happy to help. We're here for you to talk to us, for you to feel safe. And we'd like you to bring a concern to our attention, even if you do not want to demand punitive action, because it helps us in understanding the issues that are going on. It can help us guide you towards the best course of action, and it generally helps in creating a safer atmosphere. And that is all from us. Thank you and good luck. Have a safe and fun tournament.